Hey everyone, welcome to episode 30 of Trucksafe Live, the show where we and our guest tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon with Trucksafe and Childless Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Good show in store today. We're talking about log falsifications, a huge issue for lots of carriers and certainly lots of drivers. It's routinely ranks as one of the most common violations discovered during roadside inspections and also in DOT audits. So what are causing these problems, and more importantly, what can fleets and drivers do to get control of it? That's what we're discussing on today's episode. Excited to be joined again by my friends Rob Carpenter and Brian Runnels. So should be a great discussion coming up. Before we get there, a few things going on at Trucksafe. We just wrapped up our Trucksafe Fleet Compliance Boot Camp. We talked about this for many months in advance. Thanks to everybody who joined us in Orlando, Florida. It was a great conference. Thanks to the speakers and thanks to our sponsors for making it happen. Spent 2 days jam-packed full of DOT compliance discussion. It was a great discussion. Had a lot of great questions and input from those in attendance. So if you didn't catch this one, be sure to stay tuned. We're going to try and do these twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall. So we're going to start planning our next one in the spring here pretty soon. Details are available at trucksafebootcamp.com. Also, if you subscribe to our newsletter, which is the next thing I was going to recommend, you can do so at trucksafe.com/subscribe. Then we will push out notifications whenever we finalize the details for the next one of those. But we hope to see you at one of those in the future. Also, I'll mention our Trucksafe network. If you're not a member of this already, I would encourage you to join it over at trucksafenetwork.com. We also have an app available in the App Store and the Google Play Store. This is a social network for safety professionals, for fleets to gather together, ask questions, learn from one another, and have access to all of our content that we push out through Trucksafe, detailed articles, videos, podcasts, everything like that. So we hope to see you in there. What else is going on? That's about it with Trucksafe. A few things going on in the industry that are worth talking about. It's been a few weeks since we've done one of these shows, so glad to be back here with you. If you're here with us, by the way, say hey in the comments so we know that you're watching. Things going on in the industry. Saw a couple things come through last week and this week. I saw that the FMCSA is extending their comment period for their safety rating, safety fitness determination, ANPRM, Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, until the end of November 29th. This is the rulemaking that we discussed a couple of shows back, where the FMCSA is toying with potentially changing up the way that we do motor carrier safety ratings in the United States, potentially moving away from that three-tier system that we are familiar with, the satisfactory, conditional, and unsatisfactory, and potentially starting to tie those scores to your CSA scores, or those ratings to your CSA scores, which would be a huge deal. So anyway, it's early on in the rulemaking process, just an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, but the FMCSA is looking for feedback from the industry. This is your opportunity to go in there and give them your mind on this topic. So make sure you do so. You've got until November 29th now to do it. You can file those at regulations.gov in docket number FMCSA-2022-0003. The other thing I noticed this week, this came through my email. Seems like a pretty big deal. But it doesn't seem very widely published at this point. But I got this email from FMCSA's IT folks indicating that anybody who's a user of the FMCSA's portal, which is essentially going to be motor carriers that are using the portal to access their CSA scores and their clearinghouse accounts and everything that you need to keep your information up to date with the FMCSA, you're going to have to change the way that you log into that system. As of December 1st of this year, so we're talking in the next month or so, you're going to have to set up a new account through login.gov, which is the government website that allows you to do like two-factor authentication, where you got to get text messages to confirm you are who you are. But anyway, you're going to have that effective December 1st in order to log on onto your portal account. And if you don't have that by that date, then you're not going to be able to log on. So I suspect we're going to get to December 1st, and there's going to be a lot of confused people out there that aren't able to access their account. So be sure you do that. You should have gotten an email. If you're a user of the portal, you should have gotten an email about this. But be sure to do that, or else you won't be able to access the important data that you need to through your portal account. All right? So those are the couple things I had to talk about. Let's move on to today's topic, which again is log falsification. According to FMCSA data, false logs rank as the fourth most common driver-related violation discovered during roadside inspections over the past 4 years, and the most common violation discovered in DOT audits. This year alone, 2023, year-to-date, law enforcement has discovered nearly 50,000 log violations during roadside inspections, and the FMCSA has assessed hundreds of thousands of dollars in civil penalties against truck and bus companies for these types of violations. So why is this still such a problem now that electronic logging devices are commonplace, and what can carriers do to get control of the issue? That's what we're tackling on today's show. Again, like I said, grateful to be joined by my friends and colleagues, Rob Carpenter, now officially a VP and Director of Managed Services for here with us at Trucksafe, and Brian Runnels, VP of Safety with Reliance Partners. Welcome back, guys.
Hey, Brandon.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going all right. I'm glad to have you back. You both were at the boot camp with me. Appreciated your sage advice to all of those in attendance, and I know we got a lot of great feedback, so thanks again for joining me there. How was Orlando for you guys?
It was good. It wasn't hot. Too hot. Anyway.
It was a quick turnaround because I had to go from there to the MC&E conference out in Austin, so didn't get to spend much time down there. That was kind of a drag.
Yeah, a little bit. I was going to ask you, how was MCE&E?
It was good. There was with the talk of the economy being the way that it is, that pretty much ruled the day. Everything from what Chris Spear talked about to just side conversations. There's like, God, how do some people make it through this? And when's it going to get better? That boy, if I knew the answer to that.
I was going to say, did anybody have an answer for that?
No, not really. I mean, people are saying that it may start taking an upturn Q2 of next year, maybe even to Q3. I mean, it won't be a windfall where we see everything go back to 2020, 2019 hysteria, but maybe we've hit the bottom and we'll start pulling ourselves out somewhat. But they don't see it for this Christmas season, that's for sure.
Yikes. So that kind of goes along with, I saw also at that conference that ATRI released its annual report on top industry issues, kind of split out by those expressed by drivers and those by motor carriers. Did you sit in on that session? Did you make it for that?
Unfortunately, I didn't. I wasn't able to be there on that because that comes out on Saturday, mid-afternoon, so I wasn't able to be at that one. But I did read the list after the fact, and economy was number one.
It's always an interesting report to see what issues drivers think are the top issues that they're experiencing versus what motor carriers see as the top issues, and kind of comparing those two lists. We'll probably do a show or an article on that topic here pretty soon, but that's one of the big things that came out of that ATA conference here recently. But anyway, today we are talking about log falsifications. Brian, this was a great idea you had to do a show on this. I've been wanting to do some kind of content on this topic for a long time, just haven't gotten around to it. So how big of a problem in your estimation is this in the industry? Brian, I'll let you kick things off here.
I think it's getting even more prevalent, and for a couple of reasons. One, we're talking about the economy. So trucking companies are trying to move more freight with less people, and drivers are trying to make more money because maybe loads aren't as easy to come by as they once were. So between those two things, I think we're seeing the falsification happen because of both sides, both the motor carrier and the driver. And I don't know for a fact, but hey, we got to get this load there. This broker's not going to use us anymore, or they're going to fine us $500. Or, hey, Can you make it? And there's an extra 100 or $200 to do it. Could that be happening? I don't know. It doesn't sound like out of the realm of possibilities. And then drivers,
You guys were both drivers. Did you do this?
All the
me,
time.
never.
All the time.
I believe
We
you,
just
Brian.
we just talked about not lying about being a carrier and doing this, Brian, like right before the show. So just
Brian's
call
falsifying his answers on this show. As we
Right.
speak.
Yeah. But I think it could actually be hidden. Obviously, it's hidden better on paper than it is on electronic. And I think that might also be part of the issue, that it's so easy, the different ways to quote unquote hide your hours in an ELD, but they're so easy to find.
Yeah.
And, I even think that a driver would say, hey, get me through the next 7 days and it'll disappear. Well, Rob and I are both finding out this week alone from 2 different carriers that, we're working on some audit stuff with, that 6 months, that stuff just sits there and hangs out. And, when DOT comes knocking and they give you that list of drivers they want to see, it's going to be drivers that have hours of service violations, maintenance violations. Those are going to be the easy, low-hanging fruit for them to pick off. And there's so many different ways to compare logs to fuel receipts, toll receipts, maintenance repairs, you name it. There's ways to check logs against it. And it's, carriers can get in trouble with that fairly quickly.
So speaking of that, I wanted to show this. So this is from FMCSA's A&I database, which is a good place to go if you ever want to see statistical information on violation data across the entire universe of regulated motor carriers in the United States. This is the website where you can get that information. You can run a lot of cool reports. But this, I've got a couple of here that I've pulled up. So this is the FMCSA's database that kind of details safety investigations, so DOT audits over whatever time period you picked. Here I've picked the last 4 years, 2019 through 2023, and you can see I'm looking at all of the violations discovered in all of those audits over that time period, and looking at what are the most prevalent violations that the DOT investigators discover when they're in your office, or they do these off-site more and more frequently nowadays, but looking at your historical records, so not roadside inspections, but actually doing a DOT audit or compliance review. And you'll see, number 2 on the list here, false reports of duty status. It's a critical level violation, and I think that's, to your point, Brian, what a lot of motor carriers fail to understand is the consequences of these violations in the audit context. I mean, it's not just at that point a matter of your driver getting shut down roadside. Now we're talking about potential fleet-wide shutdowns if you have a systemic problem in this area, which is especially scary because if you look, we've talked about this on other shows, but if you look at the DOT's auditing methodology, the playbook that they use when they come in and do their audits, they're looking, if they're doing a full comprehensive review, they're looking at 6 different factors. They're looking at general compliance, driver issues, vehicle maintenance, hours of service, drug and alcohol testing, accident records, and hazmat. The only factor in those 6 where violations get double weighted because FMCSA considers them to be the most indicative of future crash risk are hours of service violations. So practically what that means, and I try and hammer this home with all of our clients, is that if the DOT investigator comes in, looks at your hours of service records, and finds one critical level violation in the hours of service factor, you're not getting out of that audit with anything better than a conditional safety rate. It's a matter of fact. And that is why we see so many carriers fail an audit, meaning getting out of it with a conditional rating or an unsatisfactory rating, is because they struggle with hours of service and primarily with log falsifications. Has that been your guys' experience as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it only has to be 10%. It's not a big number. So, when they're pulling those logs, they have an idea who they're going to be looking at. And you can probably bet that number is going to be above 10% pretty quickly.
And they're not picking your all-star drivers.
No,
they're picking
not.
the ones that they know have hours of service problems. These are not random audits. They are going to pick your worst performing drivers in all of these categories, and that's who you're going to be judged against.
Well, one of the things that I pulled, I didn't pull it from where you pulled yours, but one of the things that I pulled was, how much has this changed over time? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? And if you look back, it's 2018, it was 3.5% of out of service violations were for false logs, and now in 2021, it went up to 5.5, almost 6%. So it's gotten
Wow.
worse over time, like Brian was saying, but I think a lot of that goes to exactly what he was saying earlier. It's that historic thing, even when I was driving trucks, and our goal was always, I mean, I actually had carriers that gave me multiple logbooks and said, hey, this seafood has to be from Miami to Hunts Point, New York by tomorrow at 2 a.m, or you don't have a job anymore. And obviously you have that coercion factor in there now, but um, you know, it's almost like it's the cost of doing business. So if you get a $9,000 fine, and then they come back a year from now, and they give you another $9,000 fine, finding the same thing, it's like it's $18,000. If you have a large enough fleet, what is that? So there's that piece, and then the average fine for falsification is $7,000. So it's not cheap.
Yeah.
Well, and then one thing I'll tab on top of that is, what do they say? Over 80% of motor carriers out there are unrated because they haven't had a safety review. They're not going after trucking companies that are doing right. They're not in alert for hours of service. That 20% is coming from people that are having issues. It's just like I was told by an inspector one time, we don't want to do clean inspections. That's not really what they're there for. So they're not going to look at those trucks. They're going to look at the ones that have issues or potential issues, and work from there. So it's been frustrating. I guess it's just, when I brought this topic up to you, it was because it was coming out of a place of frustration over the last few weeks, where I've seen so many, primarily under 100 unit. That's kind of where I work. Of these accounts having hours of service issues, and I don't think they understand how critical, literally, these violations can be, and what they can potentially do to them at an audit, and then thereafter trying to fix the problem.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, Brian, the 10% threshold. So so when the DOT's in your office doing an audit, they're looking for what are called acute and critical violations. So critical level violations are where they are looking for a pattern of noncompliance. These are all set out in Part 385 of the safety regulations. You can see the list of violations that they deem critical and acute. And when it comes to critical level violations like false logs is a critical level violation. In order to establish a pattern of noncompliance, what they're looking for is a 10% or more violation rate. So that means that if they are looking at 100 days worth of driver logs, if they find 10 or more of them are falsified, then that's going to be a critical level violation, and that is going to downgrade your safety rating to a conditional. And then that's just that one small factor that they're looking at. If they're also looking at issues in driver qualification and vehicle maintenance, you can imagine that it doesn't take a whole lot more to get you to unsatisfactory, and now all of a sudden you're getting a fleet-wide shutdown. So the point is, it doesn't take much, particularly with log falsifications, for these to really cause serious problems. So you both kind of hinted at, and I want to kind of walk through it, kind of the distinction between how this used to be a problem with paper logs and how it is still a problem with electronic logging devices. I want to kind of walk through that. So when we were in the world of paper logs, and you guys know from experience on kind of both sides of this, but what were some of the most common ways that you would see log falsifications come up in that paper log world?
Well,
guys that were running dedicated, they wouldn't log a trip, or log the trip, then pull it out and run the next one, like they'd never run. And well, you know what? I probably shouldn't get into all the ways that you get around the signing of BOLs and fuel receipts and stuff like that.
I think the statute of limitations for you guys is probably up.
Yeah,
so
we're probably
you're
good.
safe.
They'd find a way if we told them everything. They'd find a way. But loose leaf went a long way back then. When I first started out, everybody would give you the book, and it was like it was hard to tear anything out of that book and make it look normal. Like there's a page missing, bro. Something's wrong.
You had multiple books, didn't you?
I had multiple books, but then I was turned on to the loose leaf thing. You know, when I first started getting into truck stops, you find out they have loose leaf. You buy your little binder, you do your page, you tear it out, you throw it away, and you move on with the next page. Like you just materialized out of thin air in Missouri. Nobody knows how you got there, but you're there.
Here you are.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's,
that was the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, just
that
not,
was
yeah,
easy.
either just throwing away the log or just not accurately logging where you are at particular times. And the way that, I mean, that's sniffed out pretty easily, either by law enforcement roadside. You had to get there somehow to where you are currently. So there has to be an explanation for it. Or in an audit, the most common way that they would kind of sniff that stuff out is they would compare your driver's paper logs to supporting documents, as Brian said. So whatever documentation you as the motor carrier have to kind of show where a particular driver is at a given date and time, you're supposed to be retaining that along with your driver logs. The purpose of that is so that you as the carrier and the DOT can then cross-reference those two, the supporting documents to the logs, and see, is driver John Doe actually in Michigan on April 6th at 2 o'clock p.m. when he says he is, or is he somewhere else as judged by fuel receipts or toll receipts or dispatch records, anything that the carrier is maintaining to show those things. And so that's how they would do it. They would pick a sample of driver logs in an audit, and they would request supporting documents for those logs, and they would sit there and cross-reference them. And if they didn't line up with the driver's actual logs, they would mark each one of those up as a log falsification. And like I said, if they're looking at 100 of those and they find 10 or more of them, that's all it takes. And so that's, it was a very common occurrence back then. And I think the idea with the ELD rule, at least one of the main ideas, was, well, we're going to start to get better control of this, because no longer are we going to be relying on the drivers to manually input their driving status. The device is going to know when the vehicle's in motion. And so you would have thought that maybe this would have, with ELDs being in effect now since 2019, that maybe would have gotten control of this, but it's still the tops the list for most common violations. So what are the primary culprits nowadays with ELDs that are leading to log falsifications? Rob, you want to take this one first?
Well, I have seen some people say, well, everybody knows my thing is motive, so we'll start there. But like, we had this guy who said, I can beat this motive system. I can falsify this motive log, and essentially, what they would do is they would unplug the gateway of this device, the ELD, from the ECM, and then they would just drive. And then, it's obviously not tracking anything. So the problem is still going to come in where it's like Brian said at the beginning, you might be able to beat it in these little ways on the front end, on the driver facing side, but you're almost always going to catch it on the back end because there's such a trail. Like when you plug it back in, and then you realize, hey, this vehicle moved, 200 miles. And, when it was unplugged, he was in, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and now he's in Maine, but he only drove 10 miles, and I mean, it's easy to catch now. It's not like it used to be. We could almost make it extremely difficult for you to catch it, especially with loose leaf. But now with electronics, it's, like I said, easier on the front, harder on the back to get away with.
So physically unplugging the device is one way that you end up with log falsifications. Brian, how else are we seeing log falsifications with ELDs?
I think the biggest one is either what Rob was saying or the improper use of personal conveyance. That is, it's such a gray area that it's gone too gray. And, maybe somebody does honestly make a mistake, thought they could use it when they couldn't. But I think it's just a way to switch the log over to something else when you're running late or you're not going to make it somewhere, and they just switch it to personal conveyance, or they use it to get themselves set up for the next load. I mean, there's a litany of things that you can not do with it and that people do with it. And on both accounts, what Rob was saying or the personal conveyance thing, those are both reports within the ELD system that an auditor can ask for, and yeah, it's the odometer jump report or the unassigned drive time report or the personal conveyance report, any of those.
Yeah, we got someone saying finally, or not finally. That's me inserting Rob's words for them. FYI, Samsara finally got us an odometer jump report. So, yeah, I mean, these, to Brian's point, these are reports that are not just available to investigators, but more importantly, available to you as the motor carrier that's in charge of managing this stuff that you should be running periodically, probably monthly, to see where issues are starting to arise, because you better be sure, or you better be certain, that the DOT is going to be asking and looking at those reports, and they're essentially doing those investigators' jobs for them. They are pointing them to log falsifications. So if you, as the carrier, don't know where those things are, you're only going to run yourself into trouble. So you need to, at minimum, be running not just your violation report. That seems like the most obvious one, the 11-hour, 14-hour, 70-hour violation report. I found, I've said this over and over, with log falsifications being the number two in the top violations, both roadside and in audits, those are my biggest concern on the hours of service side of things. No longer substantive violations of the hours of service regulations. And the reason is pretty simple, because if we look to that 10% threshold for critical level violations, that's on a rule by rule basis. So if you think about a DOT investigator in your records looking at 100 driver logs, they're looking for substantive violations, 11-hour violations, 14-hour violations, 70-hour violations, 30-minute rest break, and then log falsifications and missing logs. Those are the different rule sets that could potentially lead to a critical level violation. But those are all calculated separately. So if you've got drivers that are having 11-hour violations, it's probably relatively few compared to the universe of drivers who are having log falsification violations. Because all of the log falsification violations get grouped together with one another. So regardless of whether it's a personal conveyance misuse or a driver unplugging his device or mislogging their fuel time as off-duty, all of those get to group together as false logs, and then they add up to that 10% threshold. Whereas your 11-hour is viewed separately from the 14-hour, it's viewed separately from the 70-hour, so you probably have relatively few 11-hour violations and 14-hour violations and 70-hour violations. But when we group together all of your log falsifications, it does not take much to add up to that 10% threshold. So the thing I always say is your drivers you would be better off as the motor carrier for your drivers to have incurred the substantive hours of service violations than to try and conceal them and then create a log falsification. Because I would much rather have one 11-hour violation than to have 10 log falsifications because of that 10% threshold. You guys have any thoughts on kind of that mindset there? Do you agree with that?
No, I agree with that.
Well,
I'm going to say no, I don't agree with that. That would have been interesting.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, no. Well, I think that, when it comes to those violations too, on a daily basis, you're saying running that report every so often. One of the things that someone in safety has to do every morning is check that unassigned drive time report. That's just got to be assigned to somebody. And I hear it that, yeah, we talked to the driver about it and this and that, but they didn't assign the hours back. Will it throw them into violation? Yes, it probably will. And yes, you'll have to shut them down for the appropriate break, whether it's 10 hours or 34, depending on, how many hours it did throw them over and where it was. But all that time has to be assigned back in.
Yeah, you're doing yourself no good by allowing that to exist on the unidentified driving report. Same situation I just described. I would rather you assign that to the driver and put them in violation than to have that time sitting out there on an unassigned driving report, and then a DOT investigator pulls that report. They always pull that report in an hours of service investigation, and they're going to line that up against supporting documents, and they're going to see from your dispatch records that John Doe was actually at a receiver's facility on October 26th, but there's only unassigned drive time from his truck on that day, and they're going to write that up probably as a missing log, could be construed as a false log as well, but it would probably be written up as a missing log, and that's one of the things that is going to contribute to a potential critical level violation. Sorry, Rob, cut you off.
Part of it is the reporting piece. So companies have to manage these things too, and I think that's what ultimately we're all going to, but it's also only as good as what you put in it. So when you're assigning this time, I can't tell you the number of times where people have just gone in there saying, "Hey, I just got to knock out this." So the percentage in that dashboard looks good. It's like, "Hey, you're 100% compliant because you have no unassigned time or no unassigned segments." When in actuality, if you actually go in there and look at what that admin did, who might be making $10 or $15 an hour, they just went in there and started throwing in names. And I've seen it done countless times. And it's like, hey, wait a minute, this guy doesn't even work here anymore. So how is this assigned to him? And then
Or
you
there's
start
a dummy admin account.
Yeah, and you're like, wait a minute, these people don't work here. And you can run that report all day long, but sometimes that report will tell on you. And then there's the whole reporting piece as it is. So you've got it kind of goes back to the value of the system you're using too. It's like, I didn't have to say it. Somebody just came on here and said, Samsara finally got us this report. If your system's not giving you the reporting that you need, then you need to find a system that's giving you either customizable reports or better reporting structures. But it ultimately goes back to what the company, how they're managing that process. So it's only as good, that report's only going to be as good as the information your admin or whoever's managing that process is putting in it.
And if you think the consequences are severe from a DOT perspective, we haven't even talked about the highway accident litigation concerns here. If you guys don't have these log falsifications under control, imagine if one of the drivers who was routinely falsifying these logs goes and kills somebody. And now you're thrown into litigation, and you better understand that the plaintiff's attorney in that case is going to be well attuned to this issue and is going to be requesting not just the driver's logs, but also supporting documents in the context of that litigation. And they're going to find these log falsifications. And now it's going to be shown to the jury or the judge or whatever. Hey, here's all of the situations where this motor carrier allowed this driver to falsify their logs. How can we allow this motor carrier to continue operating trucks out on the roads? We have to punish them for this type of bad behavior, and that's where we see these jury awards tick up. Hours of service issues was on the top 10 list of ATRI's report, where they had a table that showed what are the most common issues that lead to a defense verdict or to a plaintiff's verdict in these types of nuclear verdict cases that we're seeing. Hours of service, I want to say, was in the top 3. It may have been the first one. But I just want to be sure we understand that it's not just the DOT concerns here. It's also the highway accident litigation concerns.
And
Well,
go ahead,
Rob.
Brian. Well, I mean, one of the places I was going to go way off task, but so you better go ahead if you want to go. But
Take it, Brian.
Just a real brief story on that is we had a customer that had a crash. That was somebody did an illegal turn and turned in front of one of our trucks, and we hit them. Actually, no, this was a prospect that we were working on, and they hit him, and it killed a couple people. And when they looked back at the last 7 days logs, there was a falsification 2 days before. Now, nothing that impacted the crash at all, but they would not reverse the crash because of that, because they said he shouldn't have been there to begin with. So, whether we could argue that some more, possibly, but, he seemed pretty firm that he was not going to overturn that.
Yeah.
So from kind of how I've always looked at this is, and this is what I meant when I was going to go way off point here, not too far off, but it's close. As drivers, going back to just when I drove and thinking about the mentality that I had to, one, the driver persona has changed a little, so it's not as bad as it was, I don't think. But I was 100% money focused when I drove trucks. So it didn't matter to me what I had to do to get as much money as possible. I was going to run that way. And with that kind of mentality, a lot of it goes back to carriers articulating their expectations to their employees, both at the time of hire and then ongoing throughout it. And not just to the drivers, but to dispatchers who are saying, hey, we need this load to be here by this time. I don't care how you get it done. A lot of it goes to the company articulating those expectations to their drivers and their dispatchers and their employees in general, to just say, hey, this is the culture we have. I don't know where you worked before, but we don't do that here. And really laying out some objective guidelines to kind of keep them fenced in. Because if you allow a driver to get that idea in their head that you're good with it, then they're going to go with it. So a lot of it, you kind of have to fence people in, especially if they're predisposed to run wild.
I get the sense that a lot of carriers, particularly smaller ones, have the impression that this is just an issue that every motor carrier has, that everybody tolerates a certain amount of log falsification. And it's just not the case. I mean, we work with the largest carriers in the country, a lot of them, and they do not tolerate a single instance of log falsification. They sniff them all out themselves because they know the consequences that flow from log falsifications. They understand this idea that it's probably better to have substantive hours violations than it is to have log falsifications, and they take care of it. They do the things that Rob's talking about. They set it out in their policy. This is exactly what happens if you try and falsify a log. We're going to find it, and we're going to do whatever our progressive disciplinary policy is, and then they stick to it because, like I said, the consequences are too severe. We got several comments here. Let's see what others are saying. Brian's asking, am I allowed to keep myself in split sleeper berth all the time, even if I don't do a split sleeper? No. I don't even know what that means, to be honest. Maybe you could clarify, Brian.
Yeah, in some of the ELD platforms, you can switch over to a split sleeper.
Like rule set?
Yeah, like a rule set, and it'll calculate for you. If the system is able to notice you went ahead and took a 10-hour break, and it gives you the normal hours back that you should be getting, I don't see why you can't stay in a split sleeper berth hour set in the ELD. Because
are there ELDs that allow drivers to change the rule set? If that's a thing, that worries me. Most of them I have seen, it allows the carrier to change the rule set, but not the driver.
I think it, you know what, we'd have to do some investigation on that, Brian, because I think there's a thing that you can tap on some of the ELD platforms that, hey, I'm going to do a split sleeper, and it'll do the calculations for you. And when you want to come out of it, you can kind of preview what things look like if you came out, if you didn't split it, or you finished the split and now you wanted to get out of it.
I see.
So
maybe it's not so much a rule set; it's more just kind of a split sleeper option versus the alternative. I'm not doing.
Yeah. I think that's what he's talking about, and
I don't. Maybe that's what Brian's asking, kind of along the topic of today's show. Maybe I don't think that would be viewed as a log falsification to keep yourself with that option turned on, even when you're not using it, because it wouldn't be changing the substantive version of your rest break. In other words, I don't think if you have the split sleeper option on, but you're not taking advantage of it, I don't think the system would be throwing or would be suggesting that there's no violations stemming from the lack of a full 10-hour rest break. In other words, I think the system should be smart enough, even if you have that turned on, to know when there are violations. But maybe I have that wrong, and I just haven't seen that play out in practice.
No, I believe you're exactly right.
Let's see. Jill here is asking, is there always a fine given when you have a critical or an acute violation in an on-site audit on top of you going conditional or unsat for your rating? That's been my experience, is that whenever there's a critical or acute violation, that it is very likely that you will subsequently get a civil notice of claim, which is how the FMCSA imposes civil penalties. And depending on the extent of those violations, it's going to dictate the amount. Is that your guys' experience?
Yep. And let's not stop the money flow there. You know, let's say it's going to cost you some money to get out of that, either in man hours within your own organization, or if you have to hire somebody like Trucksafe to help you get out of it. And then what money are you losing in the brokers that'll work with you, or customers that'll work with you, or, you know, your insurance company? Is that grounds for the insurance company that you have right now to drop you or to give you notice of non-renewal? You know, there is a ton of consequences that go with that conditional or proposed unsat rating, for sure.
It ain't cheap, that's for sure.
No.
I worked with probably 30 truck fleet a couple months ago that had a critical level of false logs that ended up with a conditional safety rating. Number one, they had to get that conditional safety rating upgraded, so they hired us to do that. It wasn't cheap because there's a lot of work that goes into getting your rating upgraded. It's not just a thing where you go to FMCSA and say, "Hey, I fixed these issues." That's not how it works. They want to see lots of evidence that you've retrained the drivers, that you have implemented new policies, that you have done your own log audit on your hours of service records, and that you haven't incurred any other violations. So there's a lot that goes into it there. And then the carrier was subsequently fined, again, 30 truck fleet for one critical level violation of false logs. They were fined $25,000 for that violation. Now, you can usually negotiate a downward reduction of those types of fines, and you could sometimes get up to a 50% reduction. But the point is, it's not just a slap on the wrist. This is real money we're talking about here. Jill's also asking, how do you help encourage motor carriers to pay hourly instead of by a mile as a measure to help with hours of service issues? Thoughts on that, guys?
I have always found it to be difficult to pay drivers by the hour because most of them don't want to be paid by the hour. You can't make as much. But I mean, again, there's a different persona of driver now than there was when I was driving trucks. So I also know people now are more focused on culture, stability, security, and where they may be more apt to accept an hourly rate. But it just depends on the persona of driver, I think.
That's a whole nother show discussing why the per mile rate doesn't work anymore. Freight's changed. I mean, we're going a little off kilter here, but freight's changed. There's very limited freight now that goes long haul, the 1,000-mile plus. Everything is so regionalized that the mileage pay hasn't seen a big enough increase to accommodate the lack of miles that are there. So, the per mile rate for long haul drivers, yeah, you wouldn't want to go to an hourly rate. You're definitely way above the bar there. But Rob, like what you said, and then you add the freight change, because was it Atree's report came out? I think the average driver drives, it's like 17 or 1,800 miles a week now. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had that done by Wednesday back in the day, so I hate to, right. Yeah. Well, I know I did sleep sometimes. So,
it's a wonder you guys are still alive.
Well, we don't do what we did, because we either got caught doing it or we got away with it, and we're just lucky.
James on LinkedIn is asking, you guys probably can't see this one, but he's asking, or he says, then you get exposed when the auditor asks for an edited log and they have a detailed list of admins making numerous log edits that can bite you. So that's a whole other issue is who's making edits to logs and how are they doing that? Are these legitimate edits or not? Have you guys seen that cause any problems?
I think it depends on how you're editing the log. I mean, if we're talking like true electronic logs, you still have to certify that edit. So I have seen carriers get irritated and say, "Hey, we're editing this time to make it correct, and you're not accepting it. So if we edit it and it comes to you for certification for your signature on that edit, you have to sign them all," which isn't right because they can't coerce you into signing something that's not correct. So
the other thing is driving time is not editable. Right. It shouldn't be. I've heard of some ELD solutions allowing you to edit drive time, which would make that ELD non-compliant. But that's that's one of the big ways that they're trying to crack down on log falsification, is by making drive time uneditable, so that we at least know how many hours accurately. We should know how many hours accurately a driver is driving. Brian, have you seen those like carrier edits causing problems in any kind of context, audits or anything like that?
Yeah, it usually comes up when there's too many hands in the pot and too many people have access to make those edits. Like Rob said, it's still got to be sent back out to the driver to approve. But oftentimes, I'm not going to say oftentimes, but there's sometimes they're not even sure what they're looking at.
Yeah. Right.
They got this edit and they're just like, yeah, okay, fine, certify.
It's a huge point though, because so often carriers edit the time. They think they're done. washing their hands of the issue. We've fixed the issue. But if the driver doesn't certify the log, now you've got another issue. Now you've got potentially missing logs, because in my experience, at least, when the FMCSA investigator is seeing a bunch of uncertified logs, they consider them missing. They're not complete. The driver hasn't taken the last step of certifying the accuracy, so then they just group all of those together and they consider them missing logs, which again, if they're looking at 100 logs and you got 10 or more that are missing, you're going to run yourself right back into a critical level violation. So definitely a trap to be wary of there. Thanks for raising that, James. Let's see. We've got one other comment here. Off topic, you said hours of service. Each substantive category is looked at individually, 11, 14, 70. What about the other categories, such as drug and alcohol, DQ files, VM? Are they like false logs? So those are also those things you've listed there. Drug and alcohol, DQ files, vehicle maintenance, those are factors. And if the DOT is looking at all of the factors for you, if they're doing a comprehensive audit, you are getting a rating in all of the factors. And each factor has their own set of critical and acute level violations. So in DQ, for example, if they're looking at driver qualification in your fleet, the two critical level violations that can cause problems in that factor are missing or expired MVRs, and then missing or expired med cards. Those are the two things that if there's a 10% or more violation rate, that can cause problems for your safety rating. But again, those other factors, the violations aren't double weighted. So you can escape an audit with critical level violations in those other factors, assuming you don't have a ton of them, with a satisfactory safety rating. But if you get one critical level violation in the hours of service factor, it's a conditional rating at best, is the point. Okay, so we got a little bit off topic there, and we're kind of running out of time. But we talked about unplugging the device as one common way we see log falsifications. We talked very briefly about PC misuse, although that's probably the most common culprit for log falsifications, and we could spend probably 3 shows talking about PC misuse. In fact, we've got a webinar, an entire 2-hour webinar we did on PC misuse. It's available in our network that I mentioned at the start of the show. If you join our network, you get access to those types of webinars. And then we also talked about, what was the last one we talked about is log falsification? Oh, unassigned driving time can lead to log falsifications. Any others that we missed there, guys?
Ghost driver.
Ghost driver. Explain what that is, Rob.
So, the way I've seen it done in the past is, it was my aunt, and she worked for a company. I'm not going to tell you which one since I'm here. And when she worked for us,
aunt under the bus here, Rob.
Yeah, she just died recently, so we're past that.
I don't laugh at this anymore then.
Oh my God! Talk about.
So the aunt she got sick, right? And she left, but she was like, hey, look, you can just use me as the ghost driver. Just leave me on, pay me a little money, and you can use my CDL, which is still active, but she couldn't work. So a lot of companies, what they'll do is they'll use the ghost driver. So, I've seen this not just happen with the aunt, but I've seen it happen in other cases. So it's, you're basically using a legal persona, so to speak, but they're not really working.
That's not the person driving.
Right. So it's usually running a team deal, which are harder to audit when you have two, and it makes it look funnier from the initial look at. But that's one of the ways I've seen it done.
Yeah, here's another common one someone raised. I meant to raise this, but thank you for raising this. We've seen issues with drivers not logging fuel or making deliveries pickups as on duty instead of showing off duty. I think may have had that one backwards. But yes, so that is so with paper logs, that was probably the main way that DOT investigators would catch you in a log falsification is they would take your fuel report, your fuel records. They would have an entire list of every time that a driver was fueling, and they would expect to see a segment of on-duty not driving time at that particular moment in time. And a lot of times drivers would log that as off-duty. And those are situations, I think this is another important caveat, is that log falsifications, a lot of them are nefarious, but some of them are just inadvertent. Like the driver just made a mistake or the driver didn't know. This fueling off duty is one where a lot of drivers just don't realize that they need to be logging that as on duty, not driving. And then that is a log falsification. If that gets discovered, not just on paper logs, but also on ELDs, that's one of the ways that the DOT still catches you, is if they see on the ELD log that the drivers logged themselves, put themselves in off duty status, and then they run the fuel report and they see that there was fueling happening at that time, that they're going to mark that up as an easy log falsification. Same thing with the loading and unloading. If they've got evidence to prove that the driver was loading or unloading, assisting in those efforts at a particular time, but they're shown as off duty on the log, easy pickings for a log falsification. Brian, any others? Did we hit them all?
Yeah, I think those are the big ones. You know, on the paper, the other, I was thinking back to some of the things that was done back then, and it would be logging at the speed limit or a mile or two under the speed limit. No matter really how long it took you to get there. You know, you get pinched in traffic or something like that. If it was a 55 mile an hour zone, you'd log it at 53. So they couldn't get you for speeding, but you made
if you were smart enough to know that trick,
Yeah.
because we saw that all the time too. Investigators would calculate how many miles you drove on the day, and they would divide it by how many driving hours you had logged on your log. And if it was, sometimes you would see crazy numbers. Like in order to get that amount of driving in that amount, or that many miles in that amount of driving time, they have to be going like 100 miles an hour or something like that. So then they would just write you up for speeding versus a log falsification. But yeah, that's a good point.
I saw one falsification that a company would use the adverse driving conditions often. That thing's almost impossible to use anyway. But that was the one thing that they would do, is they would check, if not for the whole day, a section of the day, the mileage or the odometer here and the odometer at the end, and divide it up. And if you average 57, 58 miles an hour for that entire time, there was no adverse driving conditions.
Yeah.
And they would.
Yeah, I hate that exemption. That exemption runs so many carriers into trouble because it seems like it should be useful to you, but how narrowly the DOT defines that, it's just virtually useless in most situations.
Agreed.
James on LinkedIn is asking, drivers waiting hours at a facility to load, can the driver go off duty resting in a parked vehicle and then once load is ready go on duty for their trailer hook? Is the off duty considered a false log?
I'm going to say it this way. There's a burden of proof. If you are in the sleeper berth and your truck is equipped with a sleeper berth, the burden of proof is on the officer to prove that you were not in the sleeper berth. If you were off duty, depending on the definition of resting in a parked vehicle and things like that, off duty, you have to prove that you were off duty, that you were free of any responsibility to that truck, trailer, or load. So, you can use that however you want, but that was kind of the way that, we did, is if you were in that loading facility and you weren't responsible for counting the load or loading it or anything like that, and you were in the sleeper berth, log it there. That's where you were.
Rob, any thoughts?
Same thing.
Yeah, it can get, so I agree. The investigators and law enforcement look at those critically. They see you logging long periods of off-duty time while you're at a shipper's or receiver's facility. They're going to look at it critically. But I think there are situations, as Brian said, where you can legitimately log your time off-duty. The regulation says that in order to log that time as off-duty, you have to be relieved of all responsibility for performing any work, meaning you could do whatever you want during that period where the shipper or the receiver are loading or unloading the truck. It gets a little tricky and a little gray when you're talking about a situation where, hey, you have no responsibilities to help with the loading or unloading, but you do kind of have a responsibility to stay there with the truck. In other words, the motor carrier doesn't want you leaving that truck unattended. Is that a work-related responsibility that would warrant you being left in on-duty, not driving status? There are differing opinions on that.
Well, for that, I would kind of go back to the labor rule that says, do you have to pay truck drivers, because they're out there for, just say long haul, say they're out for 28 days or whatever it is, they're not working but they are they're in possession of your truck. They can't go home and spend time with their kids. So, but do you have to log that time as like, hey, I'm technically on duty because I'm responsible to be in this truck for the next 3 weeks? No, but like he said, it's the burden of proof and how you log what you log. So I would always do sleeper berth if I was going to be there for an extended period of time. That way I could split it and use my time as efficiently as possible.
What benefit do you get out of logging it as off-duty rather than on-duty not driving? Because it doesn't extend your 14-hour rule unless you're on the split sleeper berth. So I guess what benefit does it get you?
No, in terms of say that again, Brian.
70. Yeah, that's
all
true.
right. Saves on your 70 on your cumulative hours.
Yeah, that's right.
But for me, I would try to. I shop for sleeper berth. And, if it was, especially if I knew it was a customer that I went to a lot, just say sweet potatoes, where it might take some crazy number, like 4 or 5 hours to get loaded. Mm-hmm. I would take whether I was there or not. I was going to go into sleeper berth and then split that later. And take advantage of it that way.
Yeah, so those are the two areas: split sleeper berth, and then the 70-hour rule is the benefit there. But if you're not close to running afoul of the 70-hour rule, then it really does you no good. And if you're not taking advantage of the split sleeper berth, then you're just potentially running yourself into problems. It's the same kind of deal with personal conveyance. The thing I always say about personal conveyance is if you don't truly need it, if you're not at risk of running afoul of your substantive hours of service limits, I'm turning personal conveyance off because it is only likely to cause me problems. It's only the fleets that truly need to legitimately use personal conveyance where it makes sense for them to do so, in my view. If you have drivers who are home, out and back every day and aren't at risk of going over their 11-hour or 14-hour time limits, then turn that thing off because that's just going to cause you all kinds of trouble. Last question here, and then we got a wrap here. Troy on LinkedIn is asking, can false logs occur under the short haul exemption? Can log falsifications occur for drivers that are under short haul?
I guess it depends on what you. I mean, I look at false logs as anything that's unrealistic. Any record of duty status that's not truthful. And your record of duty status, you do have one for short haul, which is your timesheet. So if you're pencil whipping the timesheet, which is easy to do because you're not differentiating drive time and on duty by regulation, and provided you're back within 14 hours, I mean. Who's to say that you drove more than the 10-hour, or the 11? So it depends on what mode you are. But
I've never seen a time card. I've never seen a time card personally written up as a log falsification. What I usually see it written up as, let's say a driver has a time card, but they should have had a log because they exceeded the short haul bounds. It would be written up as a missing log for that particular day, which would contribute to a 10% violation rate potentially. That's the most common way where I've seen that. But I agree, Rob, that even if we don't call it a false log, in other words, I don't think it would be grouped with the other true log falsifications to calculate a 10% rate. But where certainly if the investigator has reason to believe that time card is falsified, they've got other enforcement mechanisms to write that up as a falsified federally required document, even if it doesn't impact your rate there. Brian, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if you when you start talking about fueling or loading or unloading outside the time boundaries of your time card, that, like you said, that technically doesn't fall under the falsification on the pile that they're checking on a regular E-Rod, but that would definitely raise the eyebrows if something like that happened.
All right, guys. We could have spent another several hours talking about that. Appreciate you guys as always. Great discussion. Thanks everybody for weighing in with your questions. It's always more fun when we got questions coming in that we're able to address. Brian, where can people reach out if they have questions for you or want to learn more about what Reliance Partners is doing?
ReliancePartners.com. There's always exciting stuff going on there. You can look me up on LinkedIn or Facebook. I'm on both. I'm always happy to answer questions. Oh, and I'm on the Trucksafe network too on that social media platform. So that's probably the best place to get a hold, because you'll probably actually get the right answer if you put it on there and I don't answer it.
Also, check out, Brian just had an article come out. Was it Freight Waves?
Yeah, on Freight Waves about growing for the sake of growth. That we see companies outgrow their infrastructure, and this type of stuff starts happening.
Yeah, for sure. So check that out. You can check that out, FreightWaves website. Rob, where can people find out more and follow you?
I'm everywhere, but primarily on Trucksafe. So
And LinkedIn.
Yep, LinkedIn.
You need to follow Rob on LinkedIn if you're not following him. He's posting like 2 times a day. He's got some kind of crazy LinkedIn schedule, and it's all DOT. Most of it's DOT related. So be sure to follow him. If there's anything we can do to help you over at Trucksafe, safety rating upgrades, managed services, any of that type of stuff, and also all of the content that we're pushing out, online courses, YouTube channel, everything like that. Check us out over at trucksafe.com. Thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate you joining me. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you later.
See ya. Thanks, guys.